Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So welcome to the webinar. My name is Paul Hallett. I'm president of the British Society of Soil Science. I'm delighted to welcome you to this special webinar. This is being held during the week of COP30 to address global environmental challenges for soils. So the theme of the meeting today is the role of Indigenous peoples in soil health management. So before I welcome our presenters, I just want to introduce the British Society of Soil Science as the hosts of today's webinar. So we're an established international membership organization and charity, and we're committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. So we bring together a wide range of people, those working in research and academia. We've got a growing body of membership amongst professionals who implement soil science in industry, government, and all those with an interest in soils as well. So just before we begin, some basic housekeeping. There's many of you here today, so all of your microphones have been muted. We're going to be taking questions during and at the end of the presentations. So we'll be monitoring these throughout the webinar. So please submit any of your questions as we move through to the panel session afterwards. We are going to have an open discussion with all the panel members following all their talks. So we are recording today's presentation, and we've got 4 presenters today. Each of them will make a brief overview of their impactful international research. And the speakers are Ms. Simi Kamal from the Hisar Foundation in Pakistan, Alichi Franca Asawalam from Michael Okpara University of Agriculture in Nigeria, Mr. Badango Bordaloa, the Senior Advisor to the Indigenous Partnership for Agro-Biodiversity and Food Sovereignty, or TIP, in India, and Dr. Susie Haryanti Hussain, who is from the Soil Health Expert Framework in Malaysia. Okay, so we've asked all the presenters to provide a brief introduction of their area of work, and we will pass over to each of those now just to give a 5 to 10 minute introduction about their work. Now, first on my list is Ms. Simi Kamal.
Hi there.
Yep,
it's really nice to be here, and really nice to be talking about soils, because hardly anybody talks about soils. I'm a geographer, so I have worked in this area for a very long time. And if my slide could be shown, it will tell you a little bit about where I have worked for at least the last 35 years. So I'm going to be talking about the area of Thar. Thar is part of the Great Tharparkar Desert. Part of it is in Pakistan and some of it is in India. And this area is very unique in its geography, in its hydrology, and in its climate. And people are classified as indigenous. Not every definition of indigenous would apply to them, but because these people have been so isolated and have a very unique culture, a unique language, and unique lifestyle, we can say that they are a group of indigenous people. There are both Hindus and Muslims amongst this group, and the area of Thar is very well known because it is so peaceful. Muslims and Hindus dress the same way. Most of their culture is the same. The only thing they don't do is intermarry, because amongst the Hindus that live there, they believe that grandchildren of the same grandparents should not marry, whereas Muslims marry a lot amongst cousins. So apart from that, this area is very, very similar and can be classified as very indigenous. Now, what about their society and economy and their relationship to soils? I'm going to give you a little anecdote that will tell you about that. So must have been 35 years ago when I first visited the Thar area, and to get to Thar, there were no roads. So this was about 35 years ago, and it's very difficult to get to parts of this area because there were very few roads in those days, and we had to travel in old military jeeps that had been refashioned, and they were called kekra. So kekra is a crab. So it used to move in a very strange fashion. Maybe Vedonga, you will know what I mean, and you may have seen these. So they would go in this strange fashion. So I was staying somewhere very, very basic, a kind of house that you can see in the picture. And I woke up really early in the morning and I saw these women. They were holding their saris up, and there was something that they were carrying, and they were walking slowly. So I asked somebody, where are they going? And they said they are going to feed the earthworms. And they are going to feed the earthworms because if the earthworms do not turn the soil, they cannot grow anything. And that had such an impact on me that I can never forget that. And so these people who are so poor, they have so little to eat, were sharing what little they had, their seeds, etc. And every morning they would go to feed the earthworms in the little pockets where there was the kind of soil where something would grow, because all the rest of it was rock and sand. So that has really stayed with me, and that is my signature statement on what soil health means. And also, as being a member of the board of CABI, which is the Center for Agriculture and Biosciences, where we work a lot on soils and the microorganisms that live in those soils and the microorganisms that are there amongst the plants that help the plants grow and that hinder the plants from growing, what is helpful and what is not. So I, I feel that that is an area in which we, in the age of climate change, need to pay far more attention, because there are only 40 crops left that people use as their basic crops, the food crops. All the others have been lost, and we have lost biodiversity in many of our areas. So here, at least in Thar, some of that is not lost. And so we have to figure out how we preserve that and how we take this indigenous wisdom and carry it forward. These people also feed the birds with very little of what they have. And I'll talk a little later about water management and how that is done and how the soils are watered in order to allow meager, this meager agriculture to happen. So another incident or anecdote that will tell you about this was on a similar trip. I ended up in an area where there were these really shallow ponds. There were little ponds, like maybe 6 inches of water or 5 inches of water. And some of them were full and some of them were empty. So I saw this family, two kids and a mother, sitting in an empty pond when the next one was full, and they were not taking any water. This pond is not that. I'll tell you about this a bit later. They were really tiny. And so I watched there, was there for 1 hour, and then I asked everybody, why aren't they taking water? I didn't understand their language at that time. And they said that different villages have different entitlements. And so these tiny little shallow ponds belong to different villages. So even though there's nobody to watch them, they will not take water from another village's little pond. And they will wait until theirs is full. And maybe, Midanga, you know about this as well. Maybe that happened. And these skimming wells only happen where there is sharp temperature changes and where there are some highlands from which some of this water by gravity comes down and collects in these really shallow pools. So of course, in order to help out these people, I've been in rangeland management for a long time. One of the things to do was to catch the rain when it happens, and the rains happen there 1 in 5 years or whatever. So we built this whole series of ponds. This is a cello pond, then there are smaller ones, and then there is the tiniest household one. So what happens is that when it rains, this big one fills up, the medium one fills up, and all the tiny little underground reservoirs in people's homes fill up. So first they will use this water, then they will use of the smaller ponds, and last they will open the little reservoirs in their homes where it's underground. There's a little chimney, there's some aeration allowed, and there is a physical lock put in there. And people wait to collect water, so the weddings can't happen until there's enough water in their little underground pond. So these are some of the, I would say, the way that these indigenous people have learned how to live with their soils and their climates, and they have made the right kind of changes. For example, these Chillo ponds and the Chidro ponds, these are all let us say, innovations and trying to better the kind of water saving techniques that they have had in the past. And I really feel that we have so much to learn from these people, because their language, there's a language called Dhatki, which is similar to Sindhi, their music, their poetry, and what they know of philosophy, it's absolutely fantastic. Every man, woman, and child there can sing, and they sing absolutely beautifully. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you for listening to me.
Great. Thank you very much, Sumi. That was an excellent overview of the work you're doing and also the impact it's having on the ground, both to the benefit of the communities and also to soil as well. I'm going to pass over to our next speaker, who is Alechi Frank-Asawalo from Michael Okpara University. So she's a leading researcher in pest management and crop protection at the university, and she's also the co-chair of the GCS AYN Research and Scientific Committee. So over to you, Alechi.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to be here. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, it's all fine.
It's better now. Okay, thank you very much. Scientific agriculture is usually characterized by use of conventional tractors and for land preparation like harrows, plows, and fertilizer applicators, and the combined harvesters, as well as generous use of chemical fertilizers and herbicides and insecticides. However, agriculture in our indigenous communities of developing countries like Africa, where I come from, we operate on small farms, usually in scattered locations. And farmers grow both cash crops and staple annuals, what we call like intercropping systems. That's what they do here. And their livelihood, their cultural identity, and sustenance of the indigenous people are organically tied to these small farms, which are usually inheritance from parents. They are usually tied from inheritance from parents, and usually so the land tenure system makes it that people don't have large area of land to farm on. They have small fragments here and there, where they used to community in local communities. And these farms are could be inheritance from their parents, which are managed with time-tested indigenous knowledge systems. However, some components of the scientific and indigenous practices can really work together without compromising their cultural identity. For example, the indigenous agricultural practices require energy-saving tools because of the farm sizes, and use of natural products for pest and disease control is what they use in our local communities. They hardly agree to use synthetic fertilizers. When we go to the farmers to demonstrate to them to use about synthetic farmers, they don't want to use it. So basically what we tell them to do is that we try to use the local materials like biochar from cocoa pod hulls, and then they try to use materials from wood ash to add to ameliorate their soil in place of synthetic fertilizers. So growing these local staple crops for indigenous people usually will help to preserve their cultural identity, because if you ask them to use what you feel they should plant, they're not going to agree to use that. Then we also have the younger generations now. They are being engaged in preserving and evolving indigenous knowledge system. And then, so basically what we can do to encourage them now, the younger generations, to go into agriculture, climate smart agriculture, is to use of GPS systems so that they can preserve their indigenous knowledge systems and practices. We also encourage the use of soil moisture sensors and nutrient sensors, leaf meters, similar technology, so that they can use it to monitor their soil health and free crop management. The use of biochar, as I mentioned earlier on, and organic manure and biofertilizers are usually used to manage soil health. That's what we've discovered, that the young ones that we've introduced it to, that we've worked with in our network, they have been able to use it using drip irrigation, and also trying to use screen houses or greenhouses to grow crops, so that they can actually help to increase the food production in the food systems. We also need to integrate the ICT-based technologies which are compatible with indigenous practices so that they can preserve their indigenous soil knowledge. And their lives and livelihoods and sustenance of these indigenous people are organically linked to inherited soil resources and their exploitations. So we really encourage these younger generations to embark on a climate smart agriculture, even with the kind of land tenure systems that they have. With that, we can have increased production in our food systems. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alicia. That was fascinating. We're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Badanga Bordola. So he's a senior consultant specializing in regenerative practices and ecosystem governance, and he leads the climate working group of the International Nitrogen Network and serves as a sole expert for India's Supreme Court on major environmental remediation projects. So over to you, Badanga.
Thank you, Professor Paul, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone who is present here, and hello again to my fellow panelists. It's quite exciting to present the work of indigenous people, of communities all across the world that TIP, that is the Indigenous Partnership for Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty, represents. If you may go to the next slide, please. First of all, I'd like to state that TIP's vision is to ensure that the indigenous people acts as the bridge builders to a more equitable and caring world, living in harmony with nature. And we dream of indigenous people leading the protection, sustainable use, and restoration of biodiverse food system. That's our vision. But before I present, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the wisdom and stewardship of indigenous communities whose ancestral knowledge continues to guide our understanding of living soils. Even I, as a learner, having worked in the soil for the last 20-25 years, still I go to the field and I learn from them every day. And going to the next slide, I would like to touch upon today's presentation on a couple of key pointers. One is, in the present context, when soil is in the front and center of various discussions in global forum, for example, a couple of just weeks ago, we had the European Union coming up with their soil monitoring law. We have the COP30 happening, COP30 happening, where soil is also on the forefront, where organizations are coming with implementation focus, biosolutions. Right now, we need to also understand, take a step back and understand how indigenous people, and particularly the indigenous farming system in which they work in, how do they view soil compared to the modern farming system. And I have tried to, for the purpose of this webinar today, tried to look at and analyze the practice. So if you look at indigenous people, they look at soil as a living being. They are their ancestors. There's a part of a web that includes humans, the plants, the animals, the water, and the spirits. And this personification and this memory that soil has, that is what indigenous communities tell me when I go there, that they take care of soil. They don't manage soil. In a typical modern farming system, we typically manage soil as a resource, as a production medium, where primarily we try to optimize the fertilizer, irrigation, tillage, etc., to ultimately lead to increase in productivity. On the other hand, indigenous knowledge about soil management comes from observation. They are the ones that are connected to the environment. We may be sitting in our in a comfortable chair right now. We are not near to the environment. They are the ones who are managing it for generations. They, through their oral transmission and collective experience, have built this various practices. And if you look at various practices that they do, right from nutrient cycling, water management, pest control, the knowledge transmission, it's quite unique that they've compared to the modern system. If you go to the next slide, I can present about their understanding, the principles that they follow. Yeah, so if you look at the principles, typically the principles of indigenous soil care revolve around 4 to 5 various principles. One is they ensure that there is minimal disturbance to the soil, and they ensure that there is diversity, there is living roots, living plants covering the soil all across the year, which is, I think, typically we can see right now with all more, revamped kind of a regenerative ag, other kind of natural farming systems that people have again come back to. Organic matter and living inputs. This is another angle. Instead of focusing on external inputs, indigenous communities look at ensuring that organic matter is revived, is maintained. And that's why if you even recent studies all across the world have shown that communities, indigenous communities' land always have more organic matter compared to the other locations. And that means that whatever they have been doing right. IP take care of the soil primarily to three main approaches. One is they will integrate organic matter, biomass into the ground. Number two, they will implement various kind of crop diversity elements like cover crops, crop rotation, intercropping. And you know this, the whole practice of land rotation. The land rotation is linked with the belief that as a living organism, the soil needs to be given rest. And hence, instead of putting pressure on the soil, they try to give it rest and move to the next land. If you look at water management, as Professor Simi has also mentioned, the indigenous communities have their own way of managing water. Here I have tried to give one example. If you look at one picture, the 200-year or 300-year-old bamboo drip irrigation happening in my part of the world, northeastern part of India, where organizations like TIP and their partners like NESFAS have been working alongside the indigenous communities to understand this and optimize this to the present condition. Overall, what I see as an understanding and as an observer, as a practitioner working with the indigenous community, any kind of top-down approach that the current extension system is working on doesn't work there in the indigenous territories. Locally grounded systems that has been co-developed by the communities themselves only work. And hence, very recently, one of our partner organizations of TIP, NESFAS, have been awarded in the World Food Forum in Rome, where I was very fortunate enough to be present there and receive it along with our partners. If you go to the next slide, I would also touch upon some of the other elements of the practices and give you some examples. And I'll quickly run through it because of the scarcity of time. So these are a few practices all across the world. And this example, there are many hundreds of it, but I've tried to just touch few of the areas where we work. TIP work with their partner NESFAS in Meghalaya, in northeastern part of India. And indigenous farmers in Meghalaya have been using something called Soflong or Flaminga vestilia, which is as a cover crop to restore soil fertility in short June cycle. Its dense canopy reduces erosion as well as root nodules fixes nitrogen, enhancing soil biologically, sustaining yields. This has been proven even later on through modern scientific research that this practice, which has been done since generation, actually is to be promoted, needs to be promoted. I was speaking with farmers in UP, Uttar Pradesh. This practice has been happening for 3, 4, 5 generations. They dig the soil from the base of the pond that they exist in their farm. In the summers, you just imagine the leaves from the edges from the trees falling into the pond throughout the year, decomposing at the bottom of the pond. Imagine the amount of bacterial composition, the microbial population that is there. And this has been proven not only, unfortunately, not in India, but even in other countries. Very recently, in 2024, in Ukraine, for example, they have done a meta-analysis of the nutrient content of the various bottom soil of ponds that exist. So we in the modern science also are understanding and learning from the indigenous population. The other example is from the Philippines. We have this contour-based design built by Ifugu tribe maybe 2,000 years ago. And this is a blend of engineering, ecology, culture across steep mountain slopes that have been sustaining since so many years. Livestock penning is another example where soil fertility focus is there, wherein animals from the community are collected, they are kept in a particular location over the night so that the excreta, the urine can get mixed with the soil and make contribute towards the fertility. If you go to the next slide, I'll touch upon all the three elements, because soil health as of now is on the focus. There is a definition also that has come up. Physical soil health means that we need to maintain the physical, chemical, and the biological system so that it continues to provide us the ecosystem services, right? But of late, if you look back, soil test report typically are covering only physical and chemical. Even if you go look globally, very less biological data is coming out, right? And so this is something that the indigenous community knew many hundred thousands of years ago, that we have to look at all the three dimensions. Just now we have various laws being put, and they are including all these parameters. But this example from northeastern part of India, where I belong, where NASPAS works, TIP works with their partners, this is a way of adding organic manure from the tree leaves that comes available nearby. Use of rice husk added with poultry manure, cow dung, with the house ash, which is coming from the kitchen after, if they're cooking the meal with the firewood, whatever ash from the kitchen, it's again diverted back. So this example and the previous example of the pond bottom soil, what are these? These are all circular economic principles in practice. And all these are thousands of years old. With that, I will just close, but with the call to action that we need to ensure that the indigenous community are in the front and center of all the discussions around soil. They need not be only participants. They need to basically focus. We need to all make sure that we recognize these practices and give them the due credit and try to co-create along with the modern science the indigenous practices. Recognition of the tenure system of the soil of the land that indigenous community resides is very important. Otherwise, the investment on the soil or any kind of long-term investment will be deterred. So we need to ensure that there is there is a collective effort to ensure there is recognition and legal protection of the indigenous land tenure system, and their place-based hyper-local knowledge system. And modern science needs to move from chemistry, physics to biology in a more holistic way. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Badanga. That was a really thorough presentation. We're now going to go over to our final speaker before we go to the panel session. And she is Dr. Susie Haryanti Hussain. So she's founder and director of the SHE Intelligence in Malaysia. And she designed soil health and ESG aligned frameworks across Asia, linking field diagnostics to investment grade reporting and regenerative transitions in key agri-systems. So over to you, Susie.
Okay, thank you, Professor Paul, and greeting from Malaysia. So I'm Dr. Suzy Haryanti and founder of SHE Intelligence, a soil health and governance initiative that connects science with the people and policy. So my journey started about 17 years ago, just not only in the office, but in the lab, or even in the labs, right? So I have been across in the oil palm estates, paddy fields and pineapple farms across the Southeast Asia. So everywhere I went, the pattern repeated itself. So you can say most of the farmers give the response that soil look fine on paper, right? So we can see on the high yield, have a correct pH, yet in the field, we can say that they were dead, because you could see in the roots, the smell in the air that the soil was sour, compacted and suffocating. So farmer would say to me that, doctor, I have fertilized a lot, right? But the soil doesn't live, right? So this is the sentence that haunted me, which is that because I think it was true, which is that something that what the gaps I didn't know, right? So because we need to understand that we just don't have a fertility problem, right? So we have a governance problem. So we can say that soil was being managed for numbers or not for the life, and the way we treat the soil often that mirrors that with the way we govern everything else, so reactively, not regeneratively. So that's why, based on this realization, so you can see that lead me to design the SHE framework, which is that stand for a soil health experts, which is that system that measure the soil health based on biology, chemistry, and structure, but starts with something the more intuitive, which means that what the farmers can see, what the farmers can smell, or even the touch. Okay, let me explain. Let me explain to you by using this photo. Alright, so you can see that here the comparing. Can you go to the next slide? You can see on the how we comparing the soil color, which means that from the pale gray to dark chocolate. So I have them ask them, so which one that looks alive, right? And they always point at the darkest one, because the instinctively that they know, right? So in the sheet training, so we teach the color as an indicators of oxidation and organic matter, which is that pale gray soil means that oxygen stress and poor microbial life, or even the reddish or brown tones show the active ion cycling, and the dark chocolate means that good carbon and life returning. So then when we look at the structure, right, so I ask them to feel it, which means that if the soil break sharply, right, so it's compacted. If the crumble softly and roots are visible, so this is that indicate the soil or the plant roots are breathing. So the next is smell, which means that you can see that the healthy soil has a gentle or earthy aroma, which means that the after rain smell. Okay, so this is smell that if the smell is like metallic or rotten, so the microbes are dying. So from this that we can, the last one on the observation and recording, so you can see that we turn these sensors into the data, which means that we were scoring each soil visually. So instead of talking about the CEC or cation exchange, so we talk about on how alive the soil feels, right? So they learn to assess the soil health through their sense first, and then the science is seconds. So for the 4 years I have been involved, people told me farmers won't understand the soil science, and I always replied that the science must learn to speak farmers, which that's why I developed or we built the She visual training toolkit, which means that we are more emphasizing on the photo, cards, and also develop the field modules that we can translate that the complex soil function into the everyday experience, right? So I think when the farmers see what they see, what you see as a scientist, so they begin to own the knowledge. And once they own, they never treat farm the same way again. So I think based on and today, the She framework is being used across Malaysia, or even we started introduced in Ghana and Pakistan. So each region reveal a different truth. So for example, there is some rice farmers that we have been involved in Malaysia. So some of us, they are using, for example, like burn rahas or compost or fish waste to rehabilitate the acidic soil, and their version of biochar, which is that long before the sign caught up. So in southern Thailand, for example, the women farmers that protect the soil biology by maintaining ground cover during droughts. And in Malaysia, like for example, like in Perak, we did trained smallholders to score their own soil visually. So and their pride is seeing more on this improvement in the real metric of success. But the challenges that we are face in the governance, that their results don't always fit into the national soil database or ESG framework, because their soil recovery isn't a measure because of their language is different. And that's why we developed the She that promote on the soil sovereignty, which is that the right of the community will own their own data and define their soil knowledge and benefit from use it. So before we founding this soil health expert or She, I work with a few agencies, and we developing on the replanting and soil rehabilitation programs. And those years show that me in top-down approaches, which mean that more faster than understanding and faster than healing. So the She is more on the reverse than logic, which means that we will focus on the field first, then we do on the policy seconds. So the soil teach us what the law forgot, which means that the regeneration begins with the relationships. So as we move forward on the COP30, so I want to leave you with this truth that soil doesn't need saving and it needs listening. So soil remembers every decision, every fire, every flood, or even chemical shortcuts, right? So, but it also forgives faster than we deserve. So we can say that when we restore its biology, the water return, crops will recover, and the land breathe again. So remember, soil is not just only a carbon sink, but actually it's a living commons. So if we measure life instead of yield, if we train through the farmers that can see, smell, and touch, so and we can connect with the local intelligence to the governance system and ESG accountability, then we can heal both ecosystem and economic. So this is what she intelligence stand for. And because every time a farmer learns to read the language by their own soil, right? So I think that's all from thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Susie. I'm going to ask all the panelists to put their cameras on, and we're going to move over to a panel session now. Please keep your microphones muted until you're asked to answer on something. But also to anyone who's attending this, we've got a Q&A box, which you can type in questions. I noticed that someone has already put some questions into it. And just to kick off, I want to go back to Susie's talk because she came up with a range of soil health indicators. They're applied all over the world. I will start with Susie, but I want to ask the other panelists the same question. Basically, when you've had the people you're working with learning about their soil, feeling it, actually seeing it, how has it changed their practices on the ground? And how well are some of these metrics tying up with some of the other measurements that you're taking? I noticed you mentioned various soil measurements in addition to the soil health ones, Susie. So I'll start with Susie, and then I'm going to pass around to the other panelists. So you're still muted, Susie?
All right. Thank you, Professor. What we've seen on the ground is that once farmer actually see and touch the condition of their soil, all right? So its color, smell, structure, which is that something shift. So this data suddenly become real for them. So in Malaysia, for example, right, when farmers, when smallholders, they go through the she scorecard process, they learn to read the soil the way you read the past, which means that you can read the past, right? So they begin linking on the darkening of the soil with biological recovery, or noticing when compaction reduces the smell. So meaning that the microbes are suffocating. So within one or 2 months or 1 or 2 seasons, all right, so you will see the real behavior change, which means they reduce the chemical use, they start use the composting, and even the time irrigation that according to the soil moisture, not the routine. So this is the their metrics. So the microbial activity, structure stability, or even the organic carbon that match closely with their visual and sensory cues. So when you track the improvement, it just not only a numbers in the reports. So farmer can see it, even the smell it and feel it by their hand. So that's when the soil has become a governance act. So it's just not only the agronomic act. All right. So I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pose a similar question to Simi, which her talk was really focusing on the link between soil and water. Soil isn't a medium that just operates on its own. It's got a much broader environmental impact. Have you noticed any changes in soil practices to preserve water quality or other issues that may protect the environments in the regions where you're working?
So in the large part of these desert areas where these communities have been there for like thousands of years, and they have been essentially unchanged, and their relationship to soil and water has been the same. So their main economy is livestock, okay, and it's also the small ruminants. So the kind of scrub that grows whenever there is a little bit of rain, that can usually support scrubland, and those bits of soils where these the scrublands grow, and where they are able to have some kind of small food grain production when there is rain. So a lot of the kind of new things that we have tried to introduce or to improve has to do with rangeland management. So the water practices have remained essentially unchanged. And all we can do is to make small improvements, because you can't build canals here. There are no great aquifers which can be exploited. And thank God that this has happened, because at least their biodiversity has remained and their soils are still pretty robust, whatever they have, and their water sources are not so contaminated. So the improvements that I was talking about, I've shown you some of them. So they used to have these tonkas, which are called little underground. They're not even reservoirs, they're really small. So they're like little tanks. And somebody asked me in the question box about how they reinforce them. So the area there is not very rocky. So basically they are building them in clayey or sandy soils. So what they do is they put very local kinds of brittle earth that they make by mixing different kinds of sands and silts, and they put them underneath. There are no rocks, there are no bricks over there. And then when it fills with water, there is some percolation. But you know, the communities know from experience which are the best places to make them, so that you know there are the kind of rock layers underneath that will stop all the water from draining away. That is why this is not a solution possible in every village. So, but you know, the villagers know where there is water and at what depth it may be. And you know, their culture and their history allows the, like water diviners, you know, they can knock on the ground and they can tell. And what I was hearing from Susie about the relationship with the soil, you know, where the soil is part of the living whole, all of that applies to this area. So, you know, they can tell where there may be water. And sometimes when you get the water out, it may not even be very sweet water. That was your question. So the water, you know, people there first of all are used to living with more brackish water than other people, and their bodies are used to it, and they drink that water. Their plants are used to it. But in some cases where it is a bit much, they are still delighted and they will still sing and dance, because then they will use that water for their households practices, and they will go elsewhere for the sweet water that they will drink and that they will use for some of their crops. So where attempts have been made to introduce monoculture or introduce other kind of non-indigenous crops and bring water from outside, there have been real failures. So the desert continues to have a little fruit called ber, which is very nutritious. So what some of us have done is to try to make bigger ber with grafting, but not cut the ber tree and have something else. And the camels in the area will eat that. So you will see that all the trees have the same height of foliage, because that's where the camels can reach. And you know, the area is so rich in insects and animals, and you know, so small chupkali, what do you say, what is chupkali in English? Lizards, different kinds of lizards, that you will be scorpions and many other things. So basically, even the improvement of the indigenous systems like the tanks or the ponds, we tried not to concretize. In some cases, in some areas where there's nothing else possible, we have to do deep boring, and then we do have to concretize, but we try to keep it to the minimum. And wherever drinking water is provided, there's also water provided for the animals, because that is something very different and new. So, you know, part of preserving the lifestyle there, living with that wisdom, means that we have to try to keep the biodiversity and the system that exists, improve where we can. We also know that if we start bringing water in by pipeline, population will grow, other people will come in, and then the land will not be able to support those great numbers. So there has, you know, this relationship between land and population and the practices, we have to really work hard not to disrupt that.
It's fascinating you brought up that example of changed agricultural practices having direct impacts on water availability, and particularly if it was a transition away from what was farmed traditionally. I don't know if, unless you can hear me, But I've got a general question for you, which is based on the amount of work you've done through a range of organizations and internationally. But where have you found that bringing in Indigenous knowledge has completely changed decisions on environmental management? And what have been the outcomes from this? So, Alechi, I don't know if your microphone is working.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really been a very good experience over here with the teaching of the young people about the Indigenous knowledge system of how to manage their salt. Initially, they will not be able to accept it because we had a student when we were carrying up a study some time ago, and we asked the students, the young people, it was rice they were working on, and they tried to introduce them to the use of chemical fertilizers, as I earlier mentioned, but they wouldn't accept it. The farmers said no, they don't want to use the chemical fertilizers for the rice production because the argument is that when they harvest the rice and with they apply chemical fertilizer, that the taste is different from the one that they harvested, that where they did not use any chemical fertilizer, where they used them manure. So what happened was that we had to carry out studies in demonstration farms, and then we tried to introduce to them the use of biochar, which they can produce, which is not expensive, is readily available. We taught them the local way of producing it, the way they can produce it locally without going to buy equipment. And by the time they agreed to use it, we're going to the farm to really to visit them to ensure that they were following up with the technology. And after harvest, we did some palatability tests, and then we asked them to check the ones that was used with the biochar, which is locally produced from cocoa pod husks, from cassava peels, which is waste materials. They don't really make use of it. They just throw it away ordinarily. And when they did that, there were promising results. They eventually saw that it was not actually changing the taste of their rice. They kind of accepted it, and subsequently the local farmers tried to use that as well. Now, another instance also was when we had to go to some local communities where my university is located. We were trying to teach the farmers, because most of the time down here, it is the women that carry out the tilling of the work, the harvesting, they do all that. The men usually do not assist them. So we now try to encourage them to use some modern equipment in the farm, like we try to provide some tractors, but they said no, they wouldn't want to go into monoculture. They want intercropping. They want tree crops. They want to harvest their mangoes as well, and have maybe like a cassava in the farm, or yam, or potatoes. They wouldn't want to do that. They prefer to adopt intercropping or have another crop alongside. They wouldn't want to do monoculture. So when we discovered that that wasn't really acceptable to them, we didn't want to push them hard. We decided to allow them go to intercropping, and then we tried to make them to adopt what we call the push-pull system, where when they harvest the crop, at the end of the day, the second crop, which they have not yet planted, the manures can be applied when like maize. When they harvest the maize and then they take the cobs away, they throw it back to the farm. It's also like manure for the tree crops. So that's how we've been working with them. And so far, it's been yielding promising results. They've been getting increased yield. And as the soil health has been improved, and there's amelioration of the soil components. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Alechi. I'm going to answer ask one more general question to Bedanga. And then in the Q&A, there's some really great questions people are posting. Please keep posting them up there, and we'll move over to those next. But to Bedanga, have you ever observed programs that have good objectives for the environment, but they end up having negative impacts on the ground, either in terms of labor, gender balance, or shifts away from traditional practices?
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question. And in fact, I would try to cite two examples. One is more on a general scale, the whole wave of carbon project that is happening all across the world, particularly around locations where indigenous territories are located. We have seen time and again that though the initial objectives are quite refined and quite defined, but most of the time we have seen that the territories are because the customary systems and the land tenure system in which the indigenous territories exist, there is a problem around it. Displacement of the traditional system is a clear-cut negative impact that we have seen. Even if you look back at some of the examples on purely focused enterprises that have been built around, say, floriculture in many parts, in many ecologically sensitive locations, we have seen that though the initial intent was very focused around, say, floriculture development, we have seen that its impact on, say, degradation of the lake or drying of the lake has happened in many parts of the world, right? So there are numerous examples like that. But what I would say is that any kind of top-down effort often measures success by carbon or yield, or without and by ignoring the living soil, by living culture. And this disconnect highlights that we need to ensure that the FPIC, the indigenous communities' free, prior, and informed consent and co-creation of design is important right from the beginning of any projects. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Badanga. We're going to go over to the questions that people have posed who are attending the session, and there's some really good ones. Two jumped out, both by Bright Atori, and so I'm just going to throw this out there and let any of you answer it. So many of you gave examples of working with single communities. How do we encourage Indigenous practices to build soil health between communities, so across different communities? Does anyone want to answer that question?
Yeah, I can take that.
Yep.
You know,
okay, Simi.
Sometimes the indigenous communities, well, most of the time, indigenous communities are far off from each other. The reason why they have developed their very unique social and economic and agricultural or livestock system is because they have been rather isolated for a very long time. So, sometimes the community that they could interact with is very far away and has very different bases. So if we go, for example, to another indigenous community in Pakistan, they are called the Mahanas, and they have lived on one of the biggest lakes in South Asia, also for centuries, and they live on boats. And the entire lifestyle is completely different from that of the desert communities I'm talking to you about. And then if you look at the nomadic groups that are in the northern part of Pakistan, they have never been to any of these areas. Yes, sometimes we try to bring them together in perhaps exchanges or some seminars or workshops. But what they can learn from each other in terms of their livelihoods and the way it is very different. But how they can organize as communities, perhaps that is something that they could do, and sometimes do learn from each other in terms of what works and what doesn't work.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else have any comments on that about communities working together?
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Alicia.
Okay. Thank you very much. I can actually also suggest that other strategies that soil scientists and experts can adopt to work with indigenous communities in a way that they feel they are part of the conversation. Rather than do with indigenous practices, is that since the lives, livelihoods, and identity and sustenance of these indigenous people are organically linked to inherited soil resources and their exploitation, there is need for policies that can strengthen land ownership by indigenous people, which will certainly make a difference in indigenous soil stewardship globally. Because you find out that some local communities where land is owned by inheritance, they could be asked to, the government can ask them not to go to that land again. They won't feel happy about it. But if you allow them to practice the inheritance and then maybe get small machines that can actually get into the local farms, since we are aware that the practice they adopt, they prefer to adopt the intercropping system rather than monoculture or monocropping. So it will be possible if we can, government can actually design tools to support these indigenous people with appropriate technologies that they can use, to actually promote the community-led soil health management, and then subsequently the global soil governance. We don't have to insist or like you do it this way, but if we can actually integrate the system that they are used to, like the practice I mentioned earlier on, as against they don't want to use the chemical fertilizer, you now encourage them the alternatives that are ecologically friendly, the chemicals that are not hazardous to the environment, they are safe. The food that they use, they applied it, safe for consumption. In that way, the soil scientists can actually help them to adopt that technology, which actually will make them to be part of the conversation rather than doing away with their indigenous storage practices. We can't do away with it. We just have to integrate some measures that can actually encourage them to produce food so that we can ensure a safe system and also alleviate poverty. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alechi. And Bedanga?
I just wanted to add to that explanation that when we talk about indigenous community kind of a cooperation, I think we also need to build partnership with modern scientists, modern science, and we have to build a bridge. There is already a bridge that exists, and it is built on respect and complementarity and consent. But what science can bring is analytical precision. Indigenous community from various parts of a landscape can come together and they can offer the contextual wisdom, and which is based on ethical ground and all. So TIP in fact has done a couple of work around that. For recently we have done for FAO a work on tape. Tape study is already published. People, encourage everyone to come go and study this. We have done a study wherein all across various indigenous communities across various countries, we have studied their food system and tried to see what is their context, how they are protecting their food system. But practically, what I would say for collaboration across indigenous tribe or communities, what we need to do is three things. One is a shared indicators, coming up with a common vision, so move beyond yield and move beyond carbon and come up with aspects of biodiversity, spiritual connection that they understand, community well-being. We have to do co-creation of the research. So we have to have the scientists, but also the elders from the indigenous community who hold this knowledge. And we should not recognize them as informants to this research, but we should recognize them as a co-developer or author of this research. And most importantly is the mutual recognition of all these communities as they come together. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Bedanga. Susie, do you want to comment on that question, or there's a second part to Bright's questions, which I could ask as well?
Okay, I think for the strategy, right? So the most important shift is from the research is on communities is start with the learning with the communities, which means that we already know that indigenous farmers have their own diagnostic systems. So which means they already can read soil through the smell, moisture, even the plant behavior, long before we call it data. So our job as scientists not to override that wisdom, but we translate it into the framework that policies maker can also understand. So this is what we did in the framework, which is that every collaboration must be with the listening sessions. So we ask the farmers to describe what the healthy soil looks and feel like, and then we map their indicators color, smell, structure. So to our biological and chemical metrics. So that is a simple alignment that build trust because they see their language that reflected in our science. So we also can do a co-design tools, for example, on the visual scorecard, for example, use the pictures and sensory cues that farmers help to create it. So when they use it, they are not participants, they are actually co-authors of the knowledge. So another strategy key is that transparency and credit, which mean that, for example, like field data, reports and publication must be just like Anaga said that included as their collaborators, right? Just not only for the case study, right? So I think the last one on the reciprocity matters. When they share their knowledge, we return the results. So which means on the training or the tools that strengthen their autonomy. So I think the partnership will grow when the science learn on the humility, which means that to measure the less, we measure less, but we listen more. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to questions from Charles Sherry, and it is all about global carbon sequestration. And so how does Indigenous soil management contribute to the sequestration of carbon in soil at scales that are relevant to global climate targets? And what research gaps do you think remain? And how can we improve these contributions? So I don't know who would like to talk first on soil carbon and Indigenous communities.
If I may.
Okay, everybody, excellent.
Yeah, first, please.
Yep.
Anaga, please.
I'll pass to Badanga first.
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Susie. Yeah. So yeah, first thing, during my presentation also, I cited that various studies have already shown that the land managed by indigenous communities have a lower rate of deforestation and have more amount of carbon matter. You know, that is already there, research is out there. The most important thing that we need to understand and respect is that indigenous community are the most connected with the nature, with the soil, with all the elements of, and they know and sense the soil very well, and they have been doing it for generations. So it's a time-tested wisdom, and they know how to adapt it to the changing circumstances, the changing climate change. What we need to do to make sure that their contribution is scaled up is to ensure that they are supported. Right now, they are under-recognized, underfunded, and we need to respect them, bring them to the global forum and recognize them better and make sure that we build the right partnership with them. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll pass over to Susie, who I think was keen to answer as well.
Okay, thank you. From my perspective, right, I think that indigenous farmers already has been storing their carbon in soil for centuries, which mean that they just never call it, because their practice naturally help the land to pull the carbon from the air, and they keep it locked in the ground for the long time, right? For example, that in Mindanao, for example, the rice farmers mix the burnt husk and compost into the field. This is a local version of biochar, which that can hold carbons and improve the soil structure. And then another example is in the southern Thailand, which means that the indigenous women that keep their green cover between pineapple row instead of spraying herbicides. So those living roots feed the microbes and builds the organic matter. And in Malaysia, for example, in Sarawak, the shifting farmers leave land to rest with the natural vegetation, which means that we allowing the organic matter to rebuild before replanting. So when this practice are applied across many small farms, so they end up helping the soil store carbon while improving fertilities, water retention, and even the yield stability. But we still feel we call as face the big research gap, which means that we don't have enough data on how much carbon that stay in the soil for the long term under this system. And most studies only measure only the top 30 cm of the soil, which is that not go deeper carbon weight tree rich roots. And then the indigenous community are rarely included in formal carbon study, even through their method works, right? So to mainstreams, I think we need a community lead monitoring, which means by using the sample tools like color and structure scorecard that link to the scientific testing. So if we combine with the indigenous observation with the modern soil data, we can measure carbon more accurately, and reward will be given to the people who are already doing the work of regeneration. So we need to understand that indigenous practice does not only just reduce the emissions, but actually they rebuild the life in the soil. And that's the real foundation, I think, on the any global climate target. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Susie. Just on that, carbon is a way to trap carbon out of the atmosphere, but it's got huge soil benefits. And I think you mentioned that a lot in quite a few of your talks, actually. So it's part of Susie's soil health test, actually. Again, is that appreciated, that the carbon in the soil isn't there to lock up just greenhouse gases? It's got many more benefits. Yep, any comments? I'll take that as a yes. And I'm going to go into the next question. And this, I'd like to aim this at probably Simi to begin with. And it's about the land tenure system and how land ownership or occupancy has an impact on both environmental and soil health at the same time. So I'll pass to Simi first, but then others can contribute.
Okay, so one of the reasons why many of these indigenous communities have managed to survive with what they have is precisely because they have common lands. And they have environmental entitlements that have been there for a very long time. And especially women, they have access to these bundles of environmental entitlements, which could be what they pick from the trees, the wood that they use without cutting down the trees, you know, the skimming wells they have access to, the kind of soils they regenerate, the way they look after all life forms. So I'll give you an example of British India. So when they came, a lot of these common areas, which was called Shamilat, or they were called gauchers, were then privatized. So huge chunks of land were, first they became British land, and then they were given to these people who had shown their loyalty to the British, and this land became privatized. And when it became privatized, then it was also a system that is still operating in Pakistan. I don't know. I think it's operating in Sri Lanka, and certainly in parts of Bangladesh, maybe even India, where you have a right to water only if you own land. So if you do not own land, then nobody owes you any water. And you know, the pricing of that water has been so low that rich people can afford to have what is called rent-seeking behavior on their lands, and they don't really worry about production and all of that. They apply fertilizers, they have sharecroppers, all of that system. So a lot of the indigenous lands and those practices have been encroached upon by these systems, especially when we had the very, one of the world's largest contiguous irrigation system, and more lands. Now, I'll give you an example. I was talking about this Manchar Lake, which I said is one of the largest lakes there. So, when the rains come and when there are floods, the lake becomes really big. So in 1 year, when the lake from being big then contracted, and also in a drought year, the lands that became visible were immediately privatized and sold off to people. And after that, when the waters rose again and the lake spread out, people said, well, these Mohanas, these indigenous people who had been fishing there for centuries, they say, you can't fish over here. You no longer have the fishing rights because the land underneath is owned by us. So you get out. And in many other instances where these customary rights to fishing, etc., have been taken away from indigenous and local people, and contracts have been given to big contractors, all in the name of development. But if we look ahead, when I look ahead and I see the world 50 or 100 years from now, and I look at what my grandchildren are going to face, they will be looking for survival. Okay, the world is going to be so degraded, the lands are going to be so degraded. I mean, look at all the drinking water that is available in river basins now. you know, especially where crops and monoculture has gone on, with all the pesticides and the other inputs that we put, that water is absolutely full of pollutants, with the result that we say today that stunting and malnutrition is not because there's little food, but that's because the waters are so polluted, especially with the heavy metals in there, that the electrolytes cannot be absorbed properly. And when children drink that water, they get stunted and malnourished. These are all new kinds of connections that we are coming up with. Now, mercifully, many of the more indigenous people are still free of these problems, especially where they have managed to keep themselves more pristine. If you look at the Native Americans in North America and also in South America, the way they were decimated, and then you know they were given these reserves, but they were broken from all their cultural beings. So many of them find it so difficult to survive in the normal American society. And also what I see going ahead, there is no other way for us to go but to have degrowth and to have zero growth. Sorry, zero growth and then degrowth, especially in the north. And when that happens, we will see that these indigenous communities, which are so much at one with nature and have lived for centuries in the way that they do, they will survive, whereas the rest of us may not. And so there is so much to learn from them and from their wisdom, and not just learn, but to try to change some of our own ways of agriculture and livestock rearing and the way we live with nature, how to change that and be more one with nature.
Great, thanks very much, Simi. Would anyone else like to add to those points? Yep,
Can
Susan?
I? Okay,
Yep.
I think from the question of the land tenure is just not only the administrative, which means that actually it's related, like Bang Aga mentioned, is ecological. So which means that the way land is owned or leased or inherited, they directly determine how it's treated. So how much life retained and who is accountable for its health. So for example, in Malaysia or even the Southeast Asia, so we see a three distinct pattern, which means that on the indigenous land, the soil tends to stay biologically stable for decades, even with the external limited inputs, which means that they will indicate that land is not only a commodity, but actually it's just like Prof mentioned on the, it's a trust, right? It's just more on the, when we comparing on the short-term lease or concession system, the soil there behave like the contract, which means that there has been mined or exhausted or even forgotten. So in one study that we have been carried out, so in our pilot area, we can see a long-term tenure, which means that showed that 30 to 50% of higher microbial respiration and have a better infiltration rates that those on the 3-year commercial leases. So ownership stability will give the biological stable. So so my position is this: the soil health cannot is outlast in the insecurity for those who manage it. Right? So the governance must reform, must move alongside the biological recovery, and that include recognizing the indigenous tenure system, that not make it more just romanticizing them, but legalizing them. So this is embedding on the soil function as a legal indicators of responsible of the land use. So ultimately, when we're talking about the soil regeneration, we are also talking about the justice and also the time. So which means that justice in who would decide and what the time to let the the land or heal. So without both, the soil keep changing hands faster that it can recover. Right. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to move on to the next question. And this is a comment that was put in by Cheryl Shari in the question thread. And it's really this risk of commodifying indigenous soil knowledge, basically through intellectual property rights or commercializing some of their ideas. So how can we mitigate these risks and protect the sovereignty of these communities? So who should own, collect, and share the data? Would anyone like to answer on that?
Yeah, so I may like to, yeah, I'd like to add. In fact, in my presentation, I have stressed on this point that the knowledge that indigenous communities bring in, we should recognize them, but to ensure that they are not being monetized in a way which is beneficial to only one party. We have this whole format of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, which is, I think, the first step towards ensuring that the recognition of the indigenous communities, their knowledge is recognized as a co-author and not as a narrator or only an informant to any research. I think that is important to be done. Yeah, and I will let the other panelists to add.
Anyone else on the ownership of the data and risks?
Okay, I think I can add some more. All right, because from the, I think this is a very necessary question, because it just not only we need to understand that this is the, I think, on the heart of the entire conversation, because the danger of commodifying on the indigenous soil knowledge is real, especially when the sustainability and carbon market increasingly turn the soil wisdom into intellectual property, and often without the consent or compensation, right? So I think this is what we are seeing globally, which is that one form, the extraction, which means that but not only the mineral of this time, but actually but of meaning. So what we did, we tried to address on the, we call as a biological justice and data sovereignty, which means that the soil data, observation, and also indigenous and diagnostic must remain the property of the community that produce them. So any collaboration, whether the research institution, government, or investor, should start from the shared governance agreement, where the data rights are clearly defined. Right, so I think the broader lesson is this: we cannot some kinds of decolonize the land without decolonizing the data, because we understand that indigenous soil knowledge is not just an input, but actually it's reflection on the living intellectual system, and it must be protected on the same legal and ethical. So which means that we can give the genetic resources of pattern. So who should own the data? First, the people whose hand that touch the soil, we are definitely the indigenous people, which means that they have their own language that defines its conditions, and who's living a life that depends on it, and everyone else definitely on the scientists, companies, or also the policy maker, because I think they just only on the guests, I think, at the table. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Susie. Simi's got her hand up, so I'll pass over to her.
Yeah, so what I want to say is that I fully agree with what Susie is saying, and that's a long and painful process which we must go through. But I think certainly the lands where these people live, they have to be protected. And that is something that we should be pushing for, to ensure that how they have lived with nature is not unduly taken away because some decision maker somewhere decides, oh, let's bring some water here quickly, and we can have precision culture here, or we can have high value culture here and start exporting. All of that has to be really carefully managed. So I think protection of these lands, they're shrinking everywhere and very fast. So we have to work to make sure that we do that. I'm also thinking that since this whole conversation is in relation to COP30, so what are some of the things that need to go from here to there? And I think we need to say that the effects of climate change on these lands where indigenous people live and where they have shown us practically how you can live with nature and how we would have to live in the future. So keeping that in mind, what are those messages that we have to go? Certainly, we must try to adapt to climate change that is happening while trying to preserve the system. I think that the age of mitigation is long gone. When all that carbon was being thrown in the atmosphere and the children of the world were shouting, nobody was listening. So really, I don't think we can really mitigate, but we can adapt. And I think those adaptation policies that we need to have, someone should be raising this in the COP to see what are some of those adaptive things that we can do to preserve those areas and the lifestyle and giving water, food, and livelihood security to indigenous people.
Those are really great points, and also it's good for us to have some take-homes like that as well. Alechi, do you want to mention anything on data? And then I've got another question related to data that I'm going to ask afterwards.
Thank you. I just want to add that since we know that this land, the indigenous people, the farmers, they have their soils, they own it, their life is dependent on it, and like back home here, the land ownership is by inheritance. Their whole life is in it. They want to ensure that even their children and grandchildren have a place they call their own land. So in order to preserve this land, there should most data that's collected right now that we're in a period of climate change, that should be technology that should be encouraged, the indigenous people should be encouraged to always ensure that they don't just keep tilling a particular piece of land, because as the families grow more, they have more grandchildren, the land acquisition tends to be very small. You know, the fragmentation is very, very small for them. They don't have enough land again to go into agriculture. So the data, that whatever data is collected, should be made available to the local farmers, the indigenous people, so that they get to know how they can preserve the soil, how they can improve the fertility, how they can actually ensure that they have enough production for subsequent years. Because if they keep tilling the same place of land in a situation where we practice crop rotation, because they don't have available land over here for them to move to various, what I mean by living a fallow system is not obtainable anymore, because that same piece of land, which is by inheritance, remember they're having many children, and as children are increasing, the land available to them is reducing. So whatever land that is available, whatever research that has been done, data available should be made, should be given onto them, so that they'll be able to know what exactly they can do, especially in this period of a climate change, so that when they're practicing, they can know how to use climate smart agricultural practices in their farms, and also they can have increased production in the food systems, because continuous tillage of the land will, without any additional fertilizers or improving the soil fertility, may not be helpful to the indigenous people. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Alechi. Last question is from Dominic Bittner. So he's doing a PhD project working with indigenous communities in Ethiopia, and he's looking at using artificial intelligence and large data as well. What role do you think artificial intelligence can play within this in terms of capturing ideas and sharing them, or should AI stay away from indigenous communities? Anyone want to comment on that? So is artificial intelligence a benefit or risk? Yep, Badanga?
Yeah, I'd like to add that, yes. See, we have to embrace any new science that comes in. We should not keep the indigenous community away from any modern science. We need to embed that, but do it carefully. There are tons of initiatives, laws. I think handling data for indigenous community, whether by using AI or any other aspects, we need to make sure that there is a combination of a couple of things. One is the legal rights, which Dr. Simi has mentioned. One is the digital safeguard that typically has to have in. There is a third is a community governance, which Dr. Suji has mentioned, and also Dr. Professor Alicia has mentioned. You have tons of examples available. For example, Government of India, particularly the CSIR, Center for Science and Industry Research, along with the Ayurveda Ministry, they have all come together with something called a traditional knowledge database, wherein the knowledge, the database of the indigenous people are there, digitally available, and the local, it's being tagged, with the source of it. Even very recently, I was presenting in Colombia in one of the very related topic that the audience is asking, is about how do you, and there are tons of innovations happening, by the way, in this. How do you, make sure that the local context labels are, implemented? How do you implement the care principles? All these things are happening, and we should not never, keep away any new tech away from the indigenous community. They have the right to get the benefit of it, but at the same time, their rights and their knowledge should be protected. So I would say go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Badanga. Does anyone disagree with Badanga? Nope, so you're all in agreement. Okay, you're safe, Dominic. Susie?
I agree, but I want to add. All right, I think the artificial intelligence. The basic thing is that it helps us to scale the understanding, but it must be never replace the people who hold the understanding, because when we are talking about combining on the indigenous soil wisdom with the AI, so it's not about the teaching the machine to speak for communities, but rather helping the world hear them better. Right, so I think we can use it, right? So but we must use cautiously, because we can use it as a translator, but it's not a teacher, right? So I think this is the answer is yes. AI can hold and can should so collaborate with the indigenous wisdom, but only under indigenous rules. The goal is not to automate the soil doctor, it's more to amplify the voice of the land truth those who have always listened to at its best. If we succeed, AI won't erase the indigenous knowledge, so it will finally validate as the oldest and more precise intelligence system, I think, on the earth I have even known. All right, so I think that's all. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. That's this has been a fantastic discussion with everyone, and also fantastic talks as well. We're gonna have to wrap up, unfortunately. This would have been great to do live. I think we could have gone on for hours actually. But so on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I want to express our thanks to Simi Kamal, Badanga Bordaloa, Adelice Franca Asawalam, and Susie Haryanti Hussein, who came along and presented their work today. And also the huge amount of work that Khalid Mahmood, who's the BS Cube's Partnership and Development Manager, has put into organizing today's event as well. So Khaled's just appeared up on the screen there. So thank you very much for attending. There's going to be a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar. So hopefully you've got time to complete that. The recording of this webinar is also going to be available on our YouTube channel. The next COP30 webinar is about soils as a pathways to net zero. That's on Monday at the same time. Keep an eye on the British Society of Soil Science website at www.soils.org.uk. If you're enrolled for basis points, you can register this as a CPD event for that. And also, we have an annual conference that's taking place in December in Manchester. There's still time to register for that. It's a great place to hear about some of the latest developments in soil science. So hope to see you at future events. In the meantime, thank you for attending, and thank you very much again to all of our panelists.